Lord Marquis, from the moment that monster appeared, we began to set it up. But the construction of this giant ballista is extremely complicated and time-consuming. I am afraid that it will take some more time until it is complete. Zhang Shouji lowered his head and bowed. Wang Chong, just what's going on here? What is this giant ballista? Gao Xianxia finally could no longer suppress his questions. The Great Tang had ballistae, but he had never heard of any giant ballistae. These giant ballistae apparently needed to be put together and required a long time to set up, but Gao Xianxia had heard nothing about them. In the War of the Southwest, the Tibetans had an army of giant soldiers. My lord should know about this matter, Wang Chong said. Gao Xianxia nodded. The War of the Southwest had had far-reaching effects. Gao Xianxia had investigated the matter, so he knew that such a thing had happened. But what does that have to do with this? These giant ballistae were meant to deal with those giants, Wang Chong frankly admitted. Gao Xianxia's face froze in surprise. Ever since the end of the War of the Southwest, I wanted to make a weapon that could be used against this sort of massive opponent, but the progress has never been very smooth. The construction of the Great Tang ballistae has always been a secret, and there's never been an idea for giant ballistae before, much less anyone attempting to build one. Thus, even though a lot of time and energy has been put into this endeavor, only a little progress has been achieved. Wang Chong had been privately researching giant ballistae to deal with the skyquaking giants, not to deal with this sort of enormous behemoth. But there was no other option now, and Wang Chong could only try every method he had available to him. Even though the others might not know, Wang Chong was well aware that the Arabs did not just have one of these behemoths. This assault was merely the prelude. While Wang Chong was speaking with Gao Xianxia and the others, in the distance, Abu Muslim stood in the rear of his army, his gaze fixed on the sprawling corpse of the behemoth. After a long time, he slowly looked away. It was a failure. It seems that not even the behemoth can break the Tang defense line. Ziad frowned as he spoke. He had originally been full of hope for the behemoth army, but this was not the result he had desired. Abu Muslim remained silent, his face emotionless as he slowly turned his head in another direction. 10 zhang away stood the silent figure of Mazel in his dark red robes, the commander of the behemoth army. This is just a coincidence. As if understanding the meaning of Abu Muslim's gaze, Mazel clenched his teeth and retorted, "There is no enemy that my behemoth army cannot destroy, no city that my behemoth army cannot crush. Give me one more chance and I will destroy them. Tear apart their defense line, crush their fortifications." Mazel clenched his fists. Never had he imagined that he would meet 4 imperial great generals on one battlefield. This was no normal occurrence. Most countries the Arabs encountered did not even have this many great generals. Abu Muslim finally spoke, his voice calm and flat. "You don't need to destroy them, only tear apart their defenses and crush their fortifications. The rest isn't your concern." No matter how formidable the behemoths were, their intellect was no match for that of humans. Abu Muslim had never planned for them to utterly vanquish his foe. Perhaps they could destroy the Tang army, but they would never be able to deal with Wang Chong, Gao Xianxia, and the other elite generals. "You!" Mazel's eyes instantly exploded with rage. This was a naked disgrace and defamation. He was the commander of the behemoth army and a trusted aide of the caliph. No governor had ever treated him this way. "Do not forget His Majesty's decree. On this eastern battlefield, I am the highest commander. Everything is carried out according to my order," Abu Muslim sternly said, his expression as cold as steel, brooking no objection. "Let us not even speak about killing the enemy commanders. If you cannot even complete a simple mission like destroying the defense lines and the walls, I will kill you without hesitation. Not even the caliph will be able to save you." Mazel fell silent. Although Abu Muslim's words were extremely humiliating, all was precisely as he had said. In the East, Abu Muslim was the true ruler. Even though Mazel was unwilling, he still had to deeply bow before the East's governor of iron and blood, lowering his head. "Just as you wish, Lord Governor. I will complete your mission. I will wait here for your report." Abu Muslim gave Mazel a deep glance, and then looked away. The battle was over, but the tension was only increasing. Behind the first defense line, a crowd of craftsmen had gathered, busy at work. Countless large pieces were scattered around them, and in the middle a large device was taking shape. From its outline, it was 20 to 30 meters long. Such a large weapon was not something that 5 or 6 people could operate. Although it was still not finished, one could tell from its complexity and massive exterior that it was certain to be an extremely powerful weapon. This was Wang Chong's giant ballista. Everything has a weakness, and these behemoths are no different. No matter what, I have to find their weakness. While Zhang Shouji's craftsmen were doing their utmost to set up the giant ballista, Wang Chong was standing at the front of the army, pondering this question. He did not have a very great understanding of the behemoth army. All his information came from legends and exaggerated rumors. But the sum of the information told him that the behemoth army of the Arabian Empire had silently vanished into the river of history long before the descent of the calamity. If it wasn't because they had run into some extremely formidable opponent, then it could only be because the behemoths had some massive and innate flaw. But what is it? Just what is their flaw? Wang Chong's mind was currently whirring with thoughts. Wang Chong had never placed his hopes on the unconfirmable. After all, it was not just the lives of 1 or 2 people at stake here, but the lives of more than 100,000 soldiers, territory with a circumference of several thousand li, and the safety of Longxi and the capital. Victory was only possible if he could find a way to defeat the behemoths. Roar! While Wang Chong was thinking, the earth began to quake, and 2 enormous storms of energy, cruel and savage, suddenly appeared in everyone's perception. Wang Chong raised his head in surprise and noticed 2 massive silhouettes emerging from the horizon, not one bit smaller than the rhino-shaped behemoth from before. Gasps of shock rose from the rear of the army, and all the Tang soldiers and mercenaries who had just experienced the recent battle instantly paled. One of these massive beasts had been hard enough to deal with. 2 of them was an absolute disaster for the Great Tang. What do we do? If this continues, all of us are doomed. Waves of panic swept through the 100,000 Qixi soldiers, and everyone turned to Wang Chong and Gao Xianxia. The strength of humans was far too puny in front of these enormous beasts. At times like this, they could only place their hopes on their 2 commanders. Wang Chong said nothing. The battle was now beyond his control, and even he did not have many good solutions. Roar! Roar came after roar, and the Tang army quaked in fear at the advance of the 2 behemoths toward the battlefield. The figures of these 2 behemoths grew clearer as they ran toward the sunlight. One was similar to a giant hippopotamus, but its hide was covered in hard scales that not even the rhino-shaped behemoth had possessed, wrapping the hippo behemoth in a large suit of armor. The other behemoth had the appearance of a huge boar. Its exterior was bristling with black fur, and its 4 limbs were thick yet agile. 2 sharp white tusks protruded from its mouth, and it constantly snorted as it fixed its 2 scarlet eyes on the majestic city of Talas. It appeared ready to attack at any time. In both size and strength, these 2 behemoths seemed both more powerful and more dangerous than the rhino-shaped behemoth. Crack! A whip snapped in the air. An Arab guard walked back and forth, shouting and waving a whip more than 7 meters long as he urged the 2 behemoths forward. In a few short moments, the 2 behemoths had arrived at the edge of the western battlefield. Their arrival immediately caused the Arabs to rally. Hail His Majesty! His Majesty! His Majesty! The tens of thousands of Arab soldiers looked up at the savage and brutal behemoths, raising their arms in excitement as they loudly cheered. Everyone in the Abbasid Caliphate knew that these behemoths were the caliph's most beloved pets, the strongest symbols of his will. Even though they were extremely dangerous, they could annihilate the Arabs' enemies, making them the finest allies. Lord Governor, do you see these 2 behemoths? They have assisted me and His Majesty in conquering many countries, crushing many cities. Nothing can surpass them when breaking cities or standing strong against attacks. No matter how formidable the Great Tang's ballistae are, they will be of no threat to this pair. Their bodies, strength, and speed are far above the previous behemoth. The sower, Mazil, stood in front of the 2 behemoths and slowly turned his gaze to Abu Muslim. Abu Muslim said nothing, a few thoughts flitting through his mind as he looked at the two enormous behemoths. The names of these two behemoths were known throughout the empire, and they had branded nightmarish impressions into the minds of the people belonging to the countries they had conquered, making them not even dare to rebel. Any place these two behemoths passed would lose all sense of prosperity, leaving behind only destruction, death, and countless terrified souls. These two behemoths are the terrorizer and the destroyer? Abu Muslim's eyes widened, his expression finally showing a shift. That's right, Mazel proudly nodded. The names of these two behemoths were legends in the Arabian Empire that didn't need much explanation. Just their names alone would make one quiver in fear. Mazel was quite satisfied with Abu Muslim's reaction. He turned his head to the rear and gave the order. Begin! With the sharp crack of a whip, the earth began to rumble, and the two stationary behemoths began to slowly move once more. The tens of thousands of Arab soldiers parted to the sides, opening a path for the monsters. The two behemoths, originally very close to each other, began to slowly move away. The scaled hippo began to slowly make its way toward the two defense lines while the scarlet-eyed boar aimed its savage gaze on the lofty walls of Talas. Buzz! This minor change immediately attracted the notice of the Tang, throwing the army into turmoil. "Milord, the Arabs are beginning to move, and Talas itself is one of their targets this time. If the walls of Talas are broken, we will find it very difficult to hold on." Xue Qianjun turned to Wang Chong, his expression deeply concerned. He was not a general who was prone to panic, but these mythical behemoths' descent onto the battlefield had already exceeded the bounds of imagination. If the Arabs succeeded in breaking the walls, the Great Tang would have lost their strongest fortification before the decisive battle had even commenced. Talas contained all the supplies and equipment, and was the place where the craftsmen took shelter during battle. If the city wall fell, these people would suffer terrible casualties. Not only that, the two defense lines would exist only in name, and the Arabs would have yet another angle to attack from. Moreover, if the Arabs succeeded in breaking the walls on both sides of Talas, they would be able to combine forces with the Turks and Tibetans. Wang Chong's strategy of using the two defense lines to divide his enemies would face a complete failure. With the three empires combined, their experts working together, the Great Tang would be doomed. Gao Xianji worriedly spoke up. "Wang Chong, the situation isn't good. With our abilities, we can't deal with two of these massive beasts at once." Even this war god of the western regions seemed a little nervous. The four of them, combining the strength of the army to transform into gods, had still needed a significant amount of time to kill the rhino-shaped behemoth, and the army had lost nearly 10,000 soldiers while they were doing so. Now that there were two behemoths, the four would have to divide their strength, and the army was bound to suffer even more casualties. Cheng Qianli also appeared rather anxious. "We can't take on any more large losses, or else morale will utterly collapse." He had experienced countless bitter battles, but no matter how perilous the situation, he had always been confident in his victory, and he had always managed to stick it out. But in this battle, he did not know what the end would be or if he would be able to last. "Zhang Shouji, what is the status of the giant ballista? How long will it be until it's ready?" Wang Chong suddenly asked, his mind in a state of turmoil. "It's still no good. The giant ballista is still just an idea. We've never tested it before, so we can't tell if it will succeed, much less if it will be useful against these behemoths. We still need to adjust and modify it, but there's simply no time." Zhang Shouji called out, his silver-white hair blown about in the wind. The turbulence over the western battlefield was getting more intense, a sign that the behemoths were getting ready to charge. Danger hung thick over Talas, and everyone felt their skulls were about to burst, the intense scent of death driving them mad. Zhang Shouji was no less nervous and concerned than Wang Chong. But the giant ballista had always been an untested concept. Many areas were still raw and undeveloped. Right now, he could only do his best, relying on his abilities as the best artisan of the generation, to modify and alter the structure as he set it up. Near the giant ballista, more than 100 furnaces spat fire into the sky. Each furnace was surrounded by at least 10 busy craftsmen, black smoke pouring into the air as they melted down steel and poured it into the molds. The craftsmen under Xianxia were in the middle of constructing and adjusting the giant ballista, casting the pieces right on the spot, trying to realize Wang Chong's idea as quickly as possible. As for the final result, not even Zhang Shouji knew what to expect. Wang Chong said nothing, but his heart continued to sink. The giant ballista was an idea, a sliver of hope, but not one that he could entrust his own hopes to. He solemnly gazed at the two enormous beings, countless thoughts surging through his mind. Everyone had placed their hopes on him, even Gao Xianji. Only Wang Chong knew just how great this pressure was, but he could not show the slightest hint of strain. A few moments later, Wang Chong began to issue orders. Li Sai, pass on my order. Start moving soldiers into the city. Zhang Shouji, hasten the work on the giant ballista. In addition, I also need you to cast some conical weapons, 1 meter in diameter and at least 20 meters long. They don't need to be made well. Just get them made as quickly as possible. In fighting with these behemoths, Wang Chong's 3-foot wood steel sword and the stellar energy Vajrapestle were both insufficient. Wang Chong needed a stronger and more substantive weapon. Lord Protector General, is it appropriate to have some of the soldiers withdraw into the city? Chang Qianli somewhat uneasily said. The only reason the Arabs and Tibetans haven't attacked us yet is that all of our army is outside the city, intimidating them. If we send a part of the army back into the city, we won't have enough troops, which might cause us to be attacked from both sides. Chang Qianli was not opposing Wang Chong's decision, but he had to consider the chain reaction this decision might trigger. Daluan Ruozhen will not attack. He currently doesn't have the strength. If he does attack, we can break out from the east. Understanding this, Daluan Ruozhen won't move. As for Abu Muslim, your words were correct. He is trying to grind away at our strength. He won't casually decide to move until this objective is reached. Moreover, if the Arabs order their men to advance while the behemoths are attacking, they'll also suffer from the attacks of the behemoths. As long as we don't withdraw more than half our soldiers into the city, neither Daluan Ruozhen nor Abu Muslim will launch an assault. Wang Chong slowly explained. No one understood the state of the battlefield more than he did, and his every action and order was the product of deep and careful thought. I understand. As expected, Wang Chong's explanation managed to greatly diminish the doubt in Chang Qianli's eyes. Roar! As the two were speaking, the bellows of beasts rose from the west, the winds surged, and dust and gravel began to cloud the air of the western battlefield. The two behemoths had finally completed their adjustments and begun to attack. Boom! The two behemoths, one on the left and one on the right, suddenly began to shoot toward Talas. Rumble! The first to charge forward was the boar-shaped behemoth covered in hard bristles. In the blink of an eye, it had rushed past the hippo-shaped behemoth, its 4 hooves moving with such speed that it stirred clouds of dust more than 10 meters high. And while the hippo-shaped behemoth was not as fast as the boar-shaped behemoth, it was no slow runner. Not only did it not seem clumsy, it appeared to be extremely agile. The two behemoths picked up speed as they charged at the steel defense lines and the city of Talas. Ready! A sharp cry rang out over the defense line. All the soldiers began to get ready, particularly the ballista teams. The black ballista bolts were loaded and aimed at their targets. The ballistae were probably the only weapons in the army that could pose any harm to these mountainous beasts. Wang Chong, Gao Xinji nervously called out, watching as the distant sandstorm rapidly closed the distance with Talas. The dreadful momentum of both these behemoths charging at once far surpassed that of the rhino-shaped behemoth. After seeing the gruesome damage the rhino could inflict, Gao Xinji was well aware of just how terrifying these behemoths were. They had to be taken care of before they charged the walls. Otherwise, the army was bound to suffer massive casualties. If they were killed within the defense lines, the bodies of the massive behemoths could still inflict terrible harm on the army. In order to prevent such enormous losses, the 4 of them had to deal with them beforehand. Leave the scaled behemoth to me. As for the other one, Lord Gao, Lord Cheng, Father, it's up to you. Time was short, every second precious. Right after saying these words, Wang Chong immediately galloped out of the defense line. Li Sai Kong Xian. Bring all the Wuxiang cavalry and follow me. Wang Chong's thunderous roar echoed over the entire defense line. The behemoths were extremely strong, and anyone without outstanding agility and reaction time could not even think about approaching them. Those who carelessly approached would end up dead or horribly maimed. The only soldiers in the entire army capable of doing battle with these beings were the Wuxiang cavalry, trained by their life in the mountains to be as flexible and nimble as apes. Moreover, Wang Chong could only use the God King Yama formation by borrowing the strength of the 5,000 Wuxiang cavalry. So he needed them to sortie with him. The moment Wang Chong galloped forth, the 5,000 Wuxiang cavalry followed close behind, dragging out a massive cloud of dust behind them as they fearlessly rode toward the hippo-shaped behemoth. After accompanying Wang Chong on multiple campaigns, the Wuxiang cavalry were now an extremely determined and powerful fighting force. Regardless of the danger they faced, they would never retreat. Protector General Wang, Chang Qianli, Gao Xianji, and the others were all alarmed by this sight. No one had expected Wang Chong to make this decision, to take on one behemoth all by himself. The Arabian behemoths were dreadful beings. The combined might of 4 of their strongest generals had not been enough to stop the charge of the rhino-shaped behemoth, and now Wang Chong was riding off alone to deal with an even stronger behemoth. Chang Qianli worriedly turned to his commander. Lord Protector General, we have to call Wang Chong back. This is too dangerous. No one can deal with one of these massive beasts alone. He'll die. There's no need. Wang Yan suddenly spoke, walking up from the rear. The battlefield has always been a dangerous place rife with death. A general must be capable of understanding that every kind of situation is possible, including death. Chong'er is not a rash and impulsive person. I believe in him, and he must have a reason for doing this. We should be more focused on how we should deal with the other beast. Wang Yan turned to the boar-shaped behemoth, which was already close to the city walls. Gao Xianji gave a deep sigh and sternly declared, "That's all we can do." Tala's was extremely important, their final stronghold. The defense lines could fall, but not Tala's. No matter what, they had to stop the behemoth. Chang Qianli, Shi Yuanqing, everyone, come with me. Gao Xianji patted his warhorse and galloped off toward the boar-shaped behemoth. The great general has given his orders. Follow me. At almost the same moment, Wang Yan somberly gave his own order. Rumble. The earth shook as tens of thousands of infantry began to march out from the first defense line, the clanging and clattering of their army resounding through the earth. The moment Wang Yan's infantry began to move, the air became saturated with tension. As all the soldiers looked forward, their breathing became extremely rapid and ragged. Too terrifying. Other than the Protector Generals, no one can stop these monsters. I hope that the Protector Generals can stop them. Otherwise, we're all dead. They'll win, they'll definitely win. Please. All of them gripped their weapons in nervous tension, pale with fear. Their strength was insignificant. Their fates were truly tied to the 4 generals. Bang! The steel walls arrayed along the first defense line were constantly clattering, the shaking growing only more intense as time went on. Roar! A wave of air smashed into the walls, so forceful that one of the steel walls toppled to the ground from the pressure, crashing with a metallic clang. The 2 behemoths were now less than 2,000 zhang from the defense lines. Look over there. The figures on the walls of Tala's pointed into the distance, shouting in alarm. As expected, the first to arrive was not the hippo-shaped behemoth, but the enormous black boar. From the tall walls of Tala's, one could see the vast trail of dust, several thousand zhang long, that it had left in its wake. The vicious form of the behemoth was faintly visible in the dust. Its 2 scarlet eyes locked onto Tala's, brimming with a desire to crush and destroy. A mere glance from its eyes was numbing, causing one to feel a fear that came from the deepest depths of their soul. 2,000 zhang. 1,500 zhang. 1,000 zhang. The black boar was far faster than expected, covering a distance of nearly 1,000 zhang in the blink of an eye. The behemoth was stirring up a massive gale as it snorted and howled, rushing ever closer to the walls of Tala's. Up! A thunderous bellow cut through the plains. Gao Xianji, Cheng Qianli, and Wang Yan had arrived, each of them wielding the power of an imperial great general. 6. Ultimate Majesty's God Technique. Supreme Desolation God Formation. Mighty Miracle God Formation. Two enormous gods rose out of the earth, throwing their huge fists at the boar-shaped behemoth as they worked in conjunction with Gao Xianji, who was using the 6 Ultimate Majesty's God Technique. Great Fire Crow Art. At almost the same moment, a fierce flame more dazzling than the sun shot out of the earth, transforming into a golden crow with a wingspan of 20-some zhang. Its body seething with black smoke, it smashed into the behemoth. The Brigadier General, Level Ferganan Leader Banahan, had also arrived from the rear. Awoo! The black boar raised its head and howled in pain. Surprisingly, however, the behemoth did not stay to fight. It ignored the attacks of the 3 great generals and 1 brigadier general, and charged toward Talas. What? This sight left everyone in consternation. They hoped that they could delay the beast through battle, but the behemoth's reaction had caught them completely off guard. Moreover, through their attacks, Gao Xianji and the others had realized that this behemoth was completely different from the rhino-shaped behemoth. This hide was even thicker, denser, tougher, and harder to pierce. Moreover, the black bristles sprouting from its body seemed to possess a unique power, neutralizing a part of their attacks. Stop it! There was no time to ponder such trivialities. Everyone's minds were on edge as they chased after the boar behemoth, but it was too late. Boom! Like an asteroid crashing into a planet, the boar plowed into the thick western wall of Talas as if it were a battering ram. Boom! The earth buzzed, cracks ran through it, and dust gushed out from them, transforming the world into a sea of dust. The towering walls of Talas trembled, swaying from the base to the top so fiercely that they seemed on the verge of collapse. Countless bits of gravel and debris rained down from the walls. Ah! Cries of shock could be heard from the walls as fear spread infectiously through the city. Other than mercenaries, Wang Chong had brought along many shepherds and herdsmen. They were the ones who had driven over the cows and sheep vital for supplying the army. The attack of the behemoth was their worst nightmare. But before they could react, the black boar had once more smashed against the walls of Talas. It's not right. The first to respond was the spectating Wuxia, his brow deeply furrowed as he stared at Talas. What's going on? This Arabian behemoth is so enormous and powerful that not even 4 great generals could stop it. How could the walls of Talas stand firm against a full charge from it? Although the distant walls were trembling and seemed on the verge of collapse, what Wuxia wanted to see the most was the walls being obliterated under the charge of the beast. He was quite astonished to see the walls of Talas stand tall against this behemoth's charge. It's not that simple. Daluan Ruozen's assured voice came from the side, his scholarly and refined face showing little surprise. The city of Talas was established several hundred years ago. At the time, Talas was a wilderness, and the nearby western regions was fraught with war. When building the city, the Lord of Talas was already thinking about the problem of being besieged. So he set up an enormous myriad Rakshasa 1 earthen stronghold formation. The construction took 20-some years and the work of 700,000 to 800,000 people. The goal was to build a city on the Silk Road that would never fall, that could fend off any disaster. Moreover, the myriad Rakshasa earthen stronghold formation is itself an extremely formidable earth element formation, and the walls of Talas are constructed from large blocks of stone. The power of the earth element makes it so that the walls of Talas are like a single piece. Breaking them is no easy task. This is also why the Arabs did not use earth element warriors to attack the city, Daluan Ruozen said. Why have I never heard of this myriad Rakshasa earthen stronghold formation? Wuxia narrowed his eyes, a look of incredulity on his face. Daluan Ruozen lightly waved his sleeve and replied, "Haha, this matter was recorded in the records of the city of Talas, written more than 100 years ago. I managed to unintentionally get my hands on a copy. The Emperor of Arabia enjoys collecting books, so he probably has a copy as well. Not many people know about this matter, but there's no doubting its truth." He had always enjoyed reading books, and he collected not merely the histories and philosophical texts of the Great Tang, but those of the western regions and other countries as well. The Battle of Talas was of utmost importance, so how could he possibly neglect his homework and not gather any information on it? Huashu Huizong couldn't help but frown as he asked, "But if the myriad Rakshasa earthen stronghold formation of Talas is so formidable that not even the behemoths can break through, aren't the Great Tang in an essentially invincible position?" "Ha! It's not that easy." Daluan Ruozan shook his head and grinned. The myriad Rakshasa earthen stronghold formation was set up more than 200 years ago. Around 100 years ago, this formation began to lose efficiency. Moreover, with the shifting of the world, the formation has grown less capable of absorbing energy from the earth. In this state, the formation has only around 40 to 50% of its original strength, which means that it won't be able to last for very long. As long as that Arabian beast can keep up its attacks and push the formation to its maximum limit, the walls will fall. Daluan Ruozan's expression was indifferent and assured, his confidence bolstering the confidence of those around him. Through many years of campaigning and squaring off against all sorts of formidable opponents, Daluan Ruozan had forged for himself an astonishing intellect and skill for calculation. Although the Arabian behemoth army was a little surprising, Daluan Ruozan had quickly managed to predict the tempo of this battle. There was usually very little that could exceed his predictions. "Great Minister, then based on your experience, how long do you predict that beast will need to break the walls?" Duwu Sili suddenly asked. "If the Tang cannot find any effective method of stopping it, it won't be more than 5 minutes," Daluan Ruozan confidently proclaimed. In the distance, the entire world was swaying. The black boar behemoth outside the walls of Talas alternated between charging, shoving, and digging at the earth with its snout. Only those who had truly experienced its might understood why this behemoth was called the destroyer of cities. The speed and frequency of its attacks had far exceeded everyone's imaginations. In the space of a second, it could attack the walls 5 to 6 times. The sky resounded with its thunderous collisions, leaving everyone in the city quaking in fear. Within the city, there was nowhere to escape. Each collision of the behemoth was the god of death ringing the bell of their doom. "Hurry and kill it. Don't let it approach the walls." Gao Xianji, Chang Qianli, Wang Yan, and Banahan were all shocked and dismayed by this sight. The ferocity of the behemoth's attacks meant that the city would not be able to last for long. Boom! 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 A storm of blows crashed against the enormous body of the black boar. Gao Xianji, Chang Qianli, and Wang Yan were all frantic, their every strike carrying all the power they could muster. "It's useless. The destroyer is different from the other behemoths. Any type of attack will be greatly reduced against it. All your efforts are in vain." Mazel coldly chuckled to himself as he watched the 3 great generals attack the destroyer. The destroyer was produced with the possibility that it might be attacked by elite experts while attacking a city, so it had been designed from the start to have excellent defenses. The first behemoth, the sower, simply could not compare. Not even after the walls were broken would the attacks of Gao Xianji and the other great generals have any sort of effect on the destroyer. "Awoo!" Just when Mazel was sneering, a loud howl resounded in his ear. Shocked, Mazel turned and saw that the scaled hippo, the terrorizer, had encountered a giant 4-armed god, its entire body burning with violet flames as it punched at the head of the terrorizer. These violet flames were extremely vexing, spreading from Wang Chong's fist to the terrorizer's body, even getting in through the chinks between the scales. The terrorizer possessed an extremely formidable defense, scales even better at staving off enemy attacks than the bristles of the destroyer. But just a few punches from Wang Chong had been enough to make the terrorizer howl in pain. Mazel was completely caught off guard by this development. He could sense that the terrorizer had been severely wounded and was enduring terrible pain. Those attacks clearly posed an enormous threat to the terrorizer. "This is impossible. It doesn't make sense. No one can inflict this much damage to the terrorizer." Mazel's eyes flew open, brimming with shock. He dared not believe his eyes. "What's going on here?" Let alone Mazel, even Abu Muslim showed a look of surprise. There was no question about the abilities of the behemoths, so Abu Muslim was sure that his opponent had undergone some unforeseen change. Otherwise, a single Tang Great General would never be able to make the terrorizer howl in pain. Li Sai, attack its joints. In addition, everyone, careful of the behemoth's feet. Wang Chong's bellow thundered over the plains. His god King Yama had seized the terrorizer's head from the side, and his 4 arms were taking turns punching at it. His speculations from before had now been proved. The strength of Lu Wu was extremely effective against these behemoths, with each of his punches siphoning a large amount of vitality from the behemoth to Wang Chong. At the start, the god King Yama had only been at the basic level of strength for a great general, but the vitality of the behemoth had caused it to madly rise in strength, pushing it all the way to the middle level of great generals. Besides that, Wang Chong's own strength was increasing, climbing from St. Martial Tier 7 to Tier 8, well on the way to Tier 9, the level of Brigadier Generals. If he could reach the Brigadier General level, his strength would undergo a fundamental transformation. Both he and the god King Yama, that was the condensation of his soldier's strength, would reach a higher stage. Ruor, the hippo-shaped behemoth, was infuriated by Wang Chong's attack, bellowing as it threw its body at Wang Chong. However, while Wang Chong was weaker than Gao Xianxia, his proficiency and skills were not something that even the celestial wolf Great General Wuxia could handle, much less this ignorant beast. Bang! Wang Chong flipped over, and the enormous body of the god moved from one side of the scaled behemoth to the other. The moment he landed, his fists once more began to rain down incessantly on the behemoth. The violet flames blazed even more brightly, as each punch caused the behemoth's fire of vigor to dim. The Arab behemoth army had never encountered such a situation before. Just who is this bastard? Someone, go and kill him. Mazel's body was quivering in rage. Master archers. Where are the master archers? It's useless. The attacks of master archers are useless against imperial great generals, said Ziad, his face extremely solemn as he observed the battle. Not even Ziad had expected this sort of situation to occur. There was a reason the behemoth army had become a tool the caliph used to hold down the empire, and not even Ziad, who could use ritual tools to reach the great general level, had any confidence in fighting such monsters. Not even a seasoned general like him could explain this situation. He could only say that this young great general on the enemy side had something that could counter the behemoth army. Perhaps it was the violet flames, or perhaps it was something else. Whatever it was nothing good for the Arabs. Damn it! I don't care if master archers will be effective. That Tang has to die, whether for the caliphate or for this battle. Mazel pointed a finger at Wang Chong while his eyes looked toward the nearby Abu Muslim and Ziad, the highest commanders of the East. His duty was to besiege the city, break stalemates, and vanquish the large army of the enemy. As for the experts within the army, those were the responsibility of Abu Muslim and Ziad. Mazel's meaning was extremely clear. The Arab army of the East, particularly Abu Muslim and Ziad, had a duty to neutralize this threat. Relax. He won't survive. No matter how this battle turns out, he will never return to the East alive. Abu Muslim spoke in his dignified and vigorous voice, his eyes oozing disdain, his tone one of iron resolve. In truth, of all the Tang you see now, not one of them will be able to leave. But before this, I still need you to complete our agreement. Destroy the Tang defense and break their walls. Abu Muslim gave Mazel a profound stare. His meaning was clear. In every aspect, it was a strategically unwise move for Mazel's terrorizer to pause outside the defense line and fight with a single Tang great general. This was also not according to the wish of the Arabs. Abu Muslim needed the complete destruction of the Tang defenses. Without the steel walls, the battle would take on a completely different nature. The hundreds of thousands of Arab soldiers would have probably already crushed their enemies. Understood. Lord Governor, be at ease. I will naturally do as we agreed. Even though Mazel had never cared for anyone else before, at this moment, his face turned red as he gave a deep bow. After all, neither the terrorizer nor the destroyer had succeeded in their objectives. This was an enormous disgrace for the behemoth army. Without hesitation, Mazel waved a hand behind him, calling over a person shrouded in black who appeared to be some sort of sorcerer. Fweet! The shrill sound of a bone flute cut through the battlefield. Upon hearing this sound, the terrorizer, which had been pushed almost to the point of madness by Wang Chong's attack, suddenly sobered up. It turned away its scarlet eyes from Wang Chong, back to the two steel defense lines in the distance and the dense ranks of the Tang soldiers. Shit! The Arabs are urging on the behemoths. Wang Chong's body trembled with an ill foreboding. He had rushed out from the walls to embroil himself in battle with the behemoth precisely so that he could keep it out of range of the defense lines and avoid large losses in the army. But the Arabs had clearly noticed this and were doing their utmost to stop it. Roar! With a heaven-shaking roar, the terrorizer began to move its 4 feet, and as it rushed toward the steel walls, a tremendous strength exploded from its body. Li Sai, careful! Everyone, get back! Wang Chong's pupils constricted as he sensed danger. The Wuxian cavalry had been on the ground this entire time, attacking the behemoth's short and thick legs, many of them even charging straight at the behemoth. The behemoth's sudden movements were liable to inflict severe losses on the Wuxian cavalry. Retreat! Just moments after Li Sai, Kong Xian, and the others pulled away, they heard an enormous boom. A massive cloud of dust shot into the air as the scaled Arabian behemoth began to move at a speed completely at odds with its enormous girth. Bang! A second after several hundred Wuxian cavalry had withdrawn from the area, an enormous foot stomped down, leaving a deep footprint. Cries of alarm rose from the army. If they had been just a little slower, they would have been crushed into paste. As the Wuxian cavalry marveled at the behemoth's strength, a loud bellow suddenly came from above the behemoth. Beast, where are you going? Wang Chong was completely focused on the terrorizer, so when this behemoth suddenly exploded with strength and began to charge, the God King Yama had stretched out a hand and snatched at the behemoth's short hippo tail. Heave! Meeting with success, Wang Chong immediately got down on one knee, his body bracing as his 3 other arms grabbed onto the behemoth's hindquarters and pulled. Yet the behemoth's strength was vast, even though Wang Chong's punches had absorbed so much of its vitality. Even though Wang Chong had used the energy absorbed from the behemoth to reach the middle great general level, there was still a massive gap between him and the behemoth. When the behemoth mustered its strength and began to charge at the defense line, not even Wang Chong could stop it. Hum! A fierce wind kicked up, blowing a storm of sand and dirt toward the distant steel walls. The scaled hippo was right behind this gale. CRSSSSSH. Pulled along by the behemoth, the God King Yama's 2 legs dragged out massive fissures in the ground, stirring up their own churning cloud of dust. Damn it! I'm no match for it like this. Wang Chong grimaced. Wah! He could hear shouts of panic from up ahead as the soldiers began to back up in fear. 1,000 zhong. 800 zhong. The distance was shrinking, the air growing tense and panicked, Wang Chong's concern reaching its maximum. In the first charge, the Great Tang had already lost 10,000 soldiers. If the scaled hippo behemoth were able to hit the defense line at this speed, the army would collapse today. All the effort he had spent would be gone with the wind. All soldiers, stand ready. A sharp cry resounded over the defense line. Chun Bin's right hand tightly grasped his Wu's steel sword as he aimed it forward, his eyes fixed on the distance. At Chun Bin's words, countless ballistae began to creak as they slowly aimed at the distant scaled behemoth. All ballistae, aim up 30 degrees. Target the behemoth's head. Chun Bin's voice rang out in the tense atmosphere. He was no less panicked than his comrades, but his voice maintained its calm, his eyes forever locked onto the behemoth. The only thing the 100,000 soldiers could rely on were the ballistae. The 3,000 ballistae were the army's last hope and defense. No matter what, he could not retreat. Rumble. The earth seemed to crack open at the scaled behemoth's advance. 600 zhong. 400 zhong. As the distance shrank, the sandstorm battered the faces of the soldiers behind the steel walls like innumerable tiny needles. However, all of them remained as steadfast as stone statues at their posts. A few seconds later, The behemoth had advanced another 100 zhang, leaving only 300 zhang left. At this distance, everyone could feel a suffocating dread, the menace of death that made even the most seasoned veteran pale. But even so, none of them chose to flee. Release! As the scent of death saturated the air, Chun Bin swung down his Wu's steel sword. Boom! 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 Ballista bolts flew forward like dragons, cutting through the heavens as they shot toward the behemoth's head. The howl of these thousands of ballista bolts was like the roar of a tsunami, drowning out all other noise. Awoo! The 3,000-some ballista bolts all struck the behemoth's head, and even the scaled behemoth had to howl in pain at this tremendous blow, its vast sea of vitality significantly weakening. But the behemoth's speed did not slow. Release again! Chun Bin's expression was unchanged as he raised and swung down his Wu's steel sword once more. In the blink of an eye, a second volley of ballista bolts had been fired at the behemoth's head. Release again! A third volley was hot on its heels, each bolt stabbing through the thick scales and hide, but none of them could deal the behemoth a fatal blow. Not enough! An officer of one of the ballista teams couldn't help but worriedly call out. The behemoth's skull is too hard. After piercing through its scales and hide, our ballista bolts simply don't have the strength to penetrate its bones. Over the entirety of the behemoth's body, the head had the smallest number of scales. But if the ballista bolts couldn't pierce the skull, this meant that they would never be able to kill the behemoth, no matter how fierce their attacks were. "Milord, what do we do?" Everyone began to turn toward Chun Bin. Chun Bin was silent, his armor clattering in the wind, his hair blown into just as much disorder as his mind. The ballista army was the army's final barrier. If not even the ballisti could do anything, then it was beyond Chun Bin's abilities. But Chun Bin could not shrink back, nor could he do nothing, as the ballista army was the heart of the army's morale. But the roaring behemoth was now less than 200 zhang from the first defense line. "Chun Bin, have your troops stand aside." At this moment, a stentorian voice came from ahead. Chun Bin raised his head and saw a violet ball of flame blazing in the air. A giant four-armed god suddenly rose from behind the behemoth, hanging upside down in the air. Two of its arms pressed against the behemoth's back, flipping over the entire body to travel from the hindquarters to right in front of the behemoth. Boom! The moment the god King Yama landed, it immediately sent 4 violet-flamed punches at the behemoth's head. An enormous shockwave spread through the earth with a tremendous explosion. "Zhang Shouji, is the giant ballista done? How much longer?" Wang Chong furiously roared, the tension obvious in his voice. "No good. There's not enough time." Zhang Shouji anxiously shouted back. The craftsmen around him had nervous and anxious looks as they worked away at the giant ballista. Their foreheads were caked in sweat, but there was no time to wipe it away. More than 1,000 people were involved in building this giant ballista, all of them working as hard as they could, but it was still not enough. "There's no more time. Hurry!" Wang Chong's worried shout resounded over the battlefield. The behemoth was immensely powerful, and Wang Chong didn't know how much longer he could last against its savage struggles. The giant ballista was a vital part of Wang Chong's plan, but there was little time left. Yama descends upon the world. Wang Chong instantly used one of the God King Yama's strongest techniques. This was a technique he had not been capable of using until he had reached the middle great general level. Boom! The God King Yama suddenly crossed all 4 of its arms, and the world was suddenly filled with the wailing and curses of vengeful ghosts, the origin energy of the world gathering around Wang Chong. Boom! His feet spread apart and his body leaned forward, his 4 massive arms smashing at the scaled behemoth, unleashing a terrifying strength that immediately stopped the behemoth in its tracks. Even with the behemoth's terrifying strength, it found itself slowing down. Hua! An uproar broke out in the battlefield, not from the Tang army, but from the distant Tibetans, Turks, and Arabs. They could all see the power of the behemoths. No one had expected that Wang Chong could single-handedly block its advance. How could this be? The strength of a behemoth is not something a single imperial great general can stop. Huashu Huizong's eyes were wide in shock and surprise. He was stronger than Wang Chong, but not even he could confidently claim that he could stop this behemoth. Nothing is impossible. A price is always required to perform a feat beyond one's abilities. He has merely used his own body to take on the charge of the behemoth. It seems shocking, but in truth he's already been wounded. It is truly a foolish move. Du Wuxi's eyes were bright as he sneered. Although they were all great generals, Du Wuxi sat firmly above Huashu Huizong and Dusong Mangpoj in terms of cultivation. He could already sense that Wang Chong had taken on significant internal injuries from this move. As if in response to Du Wuxi's words, there was a crack as one of the God King Yama's arms snapped neatly at the base and thudded to the ground. "Ah! General! Milord!" Cries of alarm rose from behind the defense line, and Zhang Shouji paled. Wang Chong was currently the only barrier between the army and the behemoth. If he was injured and no longer able to stop the behemoth, everyone would be doomed before the giant ballista could be finished. "I'm fine. I can still hold." Wang Chong's voice came from above, apparently sensing the worries of his men. "Zhang Shouji, where is my weapon? Give it here." Wang Chong's voice was tinged with worry. Yama descends upon the world was one of the God King Yama's supreme techniques. By absorbing the origin energy of the world, one could greatly boost oneself, but this boost would not last for long and would have a large side effect. He could not place his hopes on the giant ballista, so he could only rely on the other weapon. The stellar energy Vajrapesal was far from enough. Wuming, Wuxia, Wui, Wooding 1, how is the progress on the weapon? Is it done yet? Can all of you not even forge a simple metal cudgel? Furious, Zhang Shouji glared at a nearby forging mold. Several young craftsmen rushed to respond. "Master, it's finished. It just needs to be removed from the mold, which will only take a little while." "Bastard!" Zhang Shouji strode over and kicked at his trusted disciples. "Mold! The mold! Is there really time to care about the molds? Truly inflexible. Hurry and get the cudgel out." Zhang Shouji was so angry that his mind was growing clouded. Without another word, he pushed aside his disciples and personally pulled the lever on the forging mold. Boom! A metal cudgel more than 10 meters long and 1 meter thick slid out of the forging mold, its surface still seething with black smoke. The cudgel had carried away parts of the mold with it, even a few screws. "Wang Chong, the weapon is here. The rest is up to you," Zhang Shouji yelled out, his hair messily blown about by the wind. "Okay." A massive foot suddenly stepped over the first defense line, and then an enormous palm descended from the sky and took up the freshly forged cudgel. "Heave!" With a grunt, Wang Chong grasped the cudgel. "Awoo!" Wang Chong's pressure on the behemoth relaxed as he reached for the cudgel, and the scaled hippo's eyes flashed with vicious light as it suddenly pressed forward. Such was its strength that even a mountain would probably collapse to this blow, but Wang Chong held it. "Beast! A good show!" Wang Chong roared, two hands gripping the enormous cudgel and smashing it down. Boom! Wang Chong struck with all his strength, and such was his might that the scaled behemoth's head was smashed right into the ground. It immediately gave a howl of pain as if its skull had cracked. The behemoth lost its balance, and more than half of its body crashed into the ground, creating a large depression. "Beast, take another one." Wang Chong stepped forward, pressing his right foot on its head. He shook the pieces of the mold off the cudgel with 2 arms, and then flipped it over, stabbing the sharp end of the cudgel at the beast's head. Awoo! There was a crack as the sharp point pierced right through the hardy scales and hide, a part of the tip sinking straight into the skull. This blow dealt severe damage to the scaled behemoth, its vigorous flame of life instantly losing half of its radiance. "Damn it! This bastard!" Mazel paled as he heard the plaintive screams of the behemoth. His nails dug into his palms and his eyes burned with loathing and fury. Even he could sense that the behemoth was in unprecedented danger. If this continued, the illustrious conqueror of cities and countries, the terrorizer whose name was synonymous with death, would end up being killed by an Easterner at Talas. "Bring me my bow." A cold and dignified voice arose from the rear. Abu Muslim narrowed his eyes as he stretched out an arm. A golden bow, half a man tall, was quickly delivered into his hands. Its red bowstring was made from the tendons of some unknown enormous beast. This was Abu Muslim's prized bow, the Bloody Massacre. It was rarely used. Abu Muslim only took it out when facing extremely troublesome opponents or situations. The Terrorizer and the Destroyer were the Caliph's symbols, and were vital for the Empire's war efforts. Whether it was for the majesty of the Caliph or victory in this battle, Abu Muslim could not allow Wang Chong to succeed. Buzz! Abu Muslim spread apart his feet and knocked a golden arrow to his bow, pulling the bowstring back so far that it made a full circle with the bow. Boom! A sound more resounding than a peal of thunder tore through the world. Abu Muslim had loosed the bowstring, unleashing the arrow. The speed of this arrow was indescribable, and in a flash, it had already covered half the battlefield, appearing right behind the behemoth. The arrow left a long vacuum trailing behind it, a white trail several thousand zhang long. But concealed behind this gorgeous sight was an extremely dreadful killing intent. No one had expected Abu Muslim to fire an arrow into the battlefield. Let alone Wang Chong. Even Duwu Sili, Huashu Huizong, and Dalwin Ruozhen were deeply stunned by this attack. Abu Muslim had fired at just the right time, precisely when Wang Chong was completely focused on his battle with the behemoth. Not good. The first to notice this oncoming attack was the distant Gao Xianxia. During his battle with the Black Boar behemoth, he just so happened to be looking in the direction of the defense line, so he could see Abu Muslim's arrow headed straight for the center of the God King Yama's chest. This was the location of Wang Chong's actual body when he was using the God King Yama formation. If Abu Muslim's arrow struck true, Wang Chong would be doomed. Abu Muslim had struck swiftly, but Wang Chong reacted even more swiftly. Wang Chong had immediately sensed something the moment the arrow was fired. Although he had still not reached the level of martial arts he had achieved from his last life, his mental state had long ago reached the peak of the Saint Martial realm. Abu Muslim's attack had been abrupt, but it could not escape Wang Chong's perception. Bang! Wang Chong's body moved to the side as he smashed the cudgel at Abu Muslim's arrow, unleashing a powerful shockwave and smashing the arrow into splinters. How could this be? Ziad's body trembled in shock as he stared into the distance, not daring to believe his eyes. The governor rarely fired an arrow, but when he did, he always chose the exact moment when the opponent could not dodge. Yet the young Tang commander in the distance had not only sensed the coming of the arrow, but had even shattered it into pieces. Ziad had never seen such a thing happen before. "My lord!" Reeling in shock, Ziad turned to Abu Muslim. His commander's body seemed just as composed and steady as before, but Ziad could sense a tinge of shock. It was obvious that Abu Muslim had also been taken by surprise, but Abu Muslim said nothing. He slowly put down his bow and seated himself back on his throne as if nothing had happened. "Take it away." Abu Muslim gave the bow to a nearby guard. "But, my lord, this might have just been a coincidence." Ziad couldn't help but speak up, his expression tinged with anxiety. "If you shoot a few more arrows, that Tang definitely won't be able to stop them." "There's no need." Abu Muslim immediately refused. "Since the first arrow was useless, a second and third arrow will be useless as well. This Tang is more formidable than I imagined. And besides, I have never loosed a second arrow." As the rear of the Arab army once more fell into silence, Wang Chong's battle with the behemoth was just beginning. Roar! The behemoth's roar resounded over Talas, its enormous body continuing to press forward against Wang Chong. Although Abu Muslim's arrow had failed to strike true, it had not been completely ineffective. While Wang Chong was briefly distracted, the scaled behemoth had used the opportunity to suddenly advance, and it was now less than 10 zhang from the first steel defense line. Its exhalations battered against the walls like mighty waves, causing them to ring and clatter. Some of the closest Tang soldiers couldn't withstand this pressure and were swept away along with their horses. Wang Chong's God King Yama was using its two free arms to hold the terrorizer's neck, but despite Wang Chong's best efforts, he was finding it harder and harder to hold on. The energy provided by Yama descends upon the world was not limitless. With each second that passed, Wang Chong grew weaker, While Wang Chong had been able to completely halt the scaled behemoth's advance at the beginning, he was now slowly being pushed back. Damn it! Wang Chong roared in fury as his cudgel slammed again and again on the behemoth's head. The violet flames manifested by the strength of Lu Wu continuing to spread into the monster's body. With each passing second, the exuberant flames of life within the behemoth dimmed and vitality surged into Wang Chong. But even in this state, Wang Chong could not stop the frenzied beast. Although a hole had been pierced through its skull, this was apparently the limit. Some invisible power prevented Wang Chong from going any deeper. Release! On the ground, Chun Bin was swinging down his right arm over and over. Countless ballista bolts flew through the air at the scaled behemoth. This time, however, most of the ballista bolts bounced off the scales, only a few of them being able to get in through the chinks. Wang Chong was holding down the behemoth, but the enormous girth of the Yama was significantly hindering the attacks of the ballista army. Release again. Chun Bin was unmoved as he once more gave the order to fire. This was the last attack they would be able to make. The behemoth could cross the boundary at any time, and a single stomp would be enough to inflict horrifying losses on the ballista army. Zhang Shouji, is it still not done? Wang Chong's worried voice resounded in the sky. Within the God King Yama, where no one could see, Wang Chong's face was as white as a sheet of paper, blood trickling down from his lips. Forcing himself to fight against the much stronger behemoth was placing an enormous burden on his body. An enormous crack suddenly began to creep across the God King Yama's back, from the shoulder to the waist. Moreover, such cracks continued to appear on the God King Yama's body at astonishing speed. In just a few moments, the God King Yama was engulfed in this fine network of cracks, making it appear like a porcelain doll on the verge of falling to pieces. This was a sign that the God King Yama was at the limits of what it could take and was going to collapse soon. On the ground, the air was saturated with tension. All the craftsmen were frenziedly at work, their faces pale and their heads feeling like they were going to explode from the anxiety. Just a little longer. Lord Marquis, you must hold. Zhang Shouji's beard was flying in the wind as he anxiously called out from the ground. At this moment, no one could understand just how much pressure he was facing. There was not enough time. Far from enough. If he had some diagram as a guide, Zhang Shouji would be able to quickly set it up. But the giant ballista had never appeared in the history of the empire. All the craftsmen, including Zhang Shouji himself, had no experience in building such a thing. There was simply too little time. Bang! Just moments after Zhang Shouji called, the giant-scaled behemoth pushed the God King Yama back once more. The God King Yama's enormous foot scraped dirt and dust as it smashed into the steel walls behind it. Boom! Amidst a chorus of gasps and screams, 7 steel walls were pulled out of the ground and sent spinning through the air. Retreat! Hurry and retreat! Screams rang out in the air as countless soldiers began to back up in panic. Before this behemoth, they were just puny ants, so weak that they couldn't even harm it, much less hold against it. 7th unit, 10th unit, 23rd unit. Fall back! Wang Chong's familiar voice rang in everyone's ear. Even in the midst of an intense battle and with his back to the army, Wang Chong still had a grasp of the battlefield situation. He himself was in extreme danger, but he still knew which units were stationed where. Boom! Upon receiving Wang Chong's order, the army standing in front of the behemoth quickly scattered to the sides. Roar! At almost the same time, the scaled behemoth turned savage, swinging its body with an agility unbefitting its girth and sending out a thick cloud of dust. Aya! Screams filled the air as the behemoth's dreadful power turned this ordinary sand and dust into lethal weapons. Ni! Unable to move in time, the warhorses caught in this sandstorm were battered into pieces, their bodies covered with tiny holes. Even their riders, wearing heavy armor, were smashed off their mounts, their insides pulped before they had even hit the ground. To an ant, even a snort from an elephant was a destructive blow, and the same principle applied to the Tang soldiers arrayed in front of Talas. The strength of man was truly insignificant before a legendary existence like this behemoth. Damn it! Wang Chong's eyes immediately turned red. With no time to think, Wang Chong took his iron cudgel and stabbed it into the earth behind the defense line. With one end of the long cudgel propped against the bedrock, he used the other end to push back against the behemoth's body. This was the only method at his disposal to prevent further mass casualties. But this was only a temporary measure. The army was still in great danger. Crack! At this moment, countless people looked on in shock as yet another one of the God King Yama's massive arms snapped off at the base, dropping to the ground in a cloud of dust. Of the God King Yama's 4 arms, only 2 were left. Within the God King Yama, Wang Chong vomited blood the moment the arm fell. Lord Marquis, Chun Bin, Sun Jiming, Chun Burang, and Zhuang Zhengping were all deeply disturbed by the sight of the arm falling. Although their cultivation levels were still insufficient, they could all sense that Wang Chong was at his limit and on the verge of falling. But the assault was still not over. Rumble! The terrorizer exploded with strength and crashed its head into the God King Yama, throwing Wang Chong Tensum Zhang. With no more Wang Chong to stand in its way, the terrorizer suddenly found itself with an empty space, the army completely undefended. Shit! Get out of the way! Retreat! Fall back! Everyone withdraw! Get out of here! We can't hold! The thousands of Tang soldiers immediately fell into chaos. Panic swept through the ranks, thick with the stench of death. The composure that the army had managed to maintain instantly collapsed into a full rout. No one could imagine the harm an unobstructed behemoth could inflict on the army. Just when the army was about to suffer terrible casualties, a shout came out from the ranks. Lord Marquis, the giant ballista is ready. Everyone, stand aside. The several thousand craftsmen that had been gathered together suddenly scattered in all directions. What they left behind was an enormous and heavy ballista. The string of this ballista was more than 10 meters long. Its body was pitch black, and many of its parts were still giving off steam, fresh from the forge. After using all the time and manpower available to him, Zhang Shouji had finally finished the giant ballista. Awoo! The moment they had finished, the behemoth began to tense up its muscles, lowering its body and head, its scarlet eyes hungering for destruction. The behemoth was readying a charge. Senior Zhang, give the giant ballista to us. Chun Bin immediately drew his sword and rushed up to the giant ballista, a string of orders leaving his lips. 7th, 10th, 12th, and 14th units. All of you, get up there. 30th and 38th units. Load the ballista bolt. With the army in chaos and everyone fleeing, the craftsman teams and Zhang Shouji exhausted, and Wang Chong having been thrown aside by the behemoth, only Chun Bin and his ballista teams still had the strength to stop the behemoth. Bang! The ballista teams immediately displayed the fruits of their training. Chun Bin had barely given the order when the ballista teams that had just been preparing to flee immediately changed direction and rushed toward the giant ballista. Several hundred ballista team members began to neatly divide up the work, showing not one bit of disorder. Creak creak. The firing mechanism was pulled open and several dozen Tang warriors swiftly loaded a ballista bolt, more than 10 meters long and weighing nearly 1,000 jin, onto the giant ballista. Boom! An enormous foot stomped past the defense line, the tremendous impact unleashing an earthquake. In a space of several dozen zhang, hundreds of fleeing cavalry were tossed into the air. The behemoth had finally broken past the defense line and begun its attack. Nearly 100,000 soldiers were now in great peril. Release! Chun Bin finally gave the order to fire. At this moment, everyone stopped breathing, their hearts leaping up to their throats, and time seemed to freeze. The giant ballista had always been a mere concept, never truly being realized. No one knew if this giant ballista would actually work, could actually fire, or if its ballista bolt could even harm the scaled behemoth. Not even its creator and builder Zhang Shouji knew these things, much less anyone else. But there was no other choice. Whether or not it succeeded, they could only try. Bang! Like an enormous dragon breaking out of the sea, the massive ballista bolt howled through the air toward the distant scaled behemoth. This ballista bolt bore the hopes of countless people, and even the fleeing mercenaries of the western regions couldn't help but turn their heads and look to the ballista bolt with eyes brimming with hope. Several dozen zhang of distance flashed by. 50 zhang, 30 zhang, 10 zhang. Time slowed to an interminable crawl as the distance between the ballista bolt and the scaled behemoth grew smaller and smaller. 7 zhang, 6 zhang. Boom! The ballista bolt collided against the head of the scaled behemoth. A woo! The moment the ballista bolt struck, the scaled behemoth reeled back, its two front limbs rising off the ground as it threw its head back and let out a mournful howl. Its already weakened vitality was once more struck by disaster, another large part of it being shorn away. Cheers immediately shook the skies. The nearly 100,000 soldiers were invigorated by this sight. Wonderful! It worked! The giant ballista really worked against that monster. The morale of the army was given a massive boost, none being happier than Qin Bin and his ballista soldiers. They had succeeded. The giant ballista that Wang Chong and Zhang Shouji had designed together had truly worked against the behemoth. The moment this giant ballista first appeared in this world, it had instantly displayed an unimaginable power. That single ballista bolt had also given an unprecedented shock to the Tibetans, Turks, and Arabs watching from the distance. What was that? When did the Great Tang get its hands on such a formidable weapon? Huashu Huaizong's eyes were twitching, that ballista bolt protruding from the behemoth's head causing mighty waves to rage in his mind. He was a great general of many years and had exchanged blows with Zhangzhou Jianxiong no small number of times, as well as interacted with several other Tang great generals, but he had never encountered a weapon like this. The behemoth army of the Arabian Empire was already surprising enough, but Huashu Huaizong was even more stunned by the fact that the Great Tang actually had a terrifying weapon that could deal with these behemoths. Although the behemoths were terrifying, they were hardly as scary if the Great Tang could mass-produce this kind of weapon. On the contrary, a Great Tang that could create weapons effective against these behemoths was far more deserving of his fear and apprehension. How could this be? When did the Great Tang become capable of standing against the Arabs? Wuxia was still the most shocked of their group. As a spectator to this entire battle, he had been closely watching everything that was going on. When the behemoth had knocked Wang Chong flying, Wuxia had believed that the battle was settled and that all that was waiting for the Great Tang was the crushing of its fortifications and complete destruction of its army. To his surprise, the enormous ballista bolt the Great Tang had used had been able to heavily wound the behemoth. What had been a clear conclusion had all of a sudden become complicated and confusing. Bastards! Just what is going on? At this moment, no one was more shocked and dismayed than the commander of the behemoth army, Mazel. The behemoths had no natural enemies, and they all had extremely formidable defensive capabilities. There was almost no human weapon that could harm them. For Mazel, the death of one behemoth in this place was already difficult enough to endure. But even more unacceptable was that these Eastern infidels had managed to create a giant weapon that could harm his behemoths. This time, Abu Muslim and Ziyad did not immediately criticize Mazel. The abrupt ballista bolt had also been a massive shock to the two Arab commanders of the East. Hurry and load! Get ready to shoot again! The emboldened Chun Bin loudly ordered. It had not killed the behemoth, but the giant ballista had already proved its worth. It was completely capable of severely wounding the Arabian behemoths. Awoo! Just as 20 to 30 ballista soldiers were carrying over another massive ballista bolt, a howl cut through the air. At some point, a pair of scarlet eyes brimming with hatred had locked onto them. At almost the same moment, a tide of baleful energy engulfed them. At this moment, all of them felt like they were in terrible danger. Oh no! The behemoth is targeting us. Hurry! Load the ballista bolt. Everyone else, prepare to protect the giant ballista. While the ballista bolt had managed to injure the scaled behemoth, it had also provoked its wrath. With a heaven-shaking roar, the behemoth turned its head and began to charge at the giant ballista. Ah! The army was in a state of panic, and even Chun Bin paled. Just when it seemed like the giant ballista and all the ballista soldiers around it would be killed by the behemoth, everyone heard an enormous roar. Out of my way! A giant figure suddenly charged out, pushing the behemoth past the defense line. My lord! Lord Marquis! The sight of that familiar figure caused the soldiers to rally once more. Although the four-armed god had lost two of its arms, it still possessed its prodigious strength. More importantly, the constant battering the behemoth had received had greatly dimmed its fire of life, and it was no longer as fierce and savage. Boom boom boom. Caught off guard, the behemoth lost its balance and was forced several steps back by the god King Yama, each step causing all of Talas to quake. Beast! Take another blow from my cudgel! Wang Chong's bellow was like a peal of thunder, and before he had even finished speaking, that enormous iron cudgel was swinging around to smash the behemoth's head. To be more precise, it was aiming straight for the large ballista bolt protruding out of its skull. Ow! The behemoth howled and quivered. Half of that ballista bolt had been sticking out of its head, but now, Wang Chong had smashed the entirety of it into the behemoth's skull, dealing it a severe wound. Wang Chong was still not finished. While the behemoth was still confused, the god King Yama began to batter away at the behemoth with its cudgel. Smack smack smack. In a few short moments, the behemoth's head was struck 30 to 40 times. Wonderful! Lord Marquis! Lord Marquis! Lord Marquis! The air resounded with endless cheers from the Tang. But in the distance, the Tibetans, Turks, and Arabs all had extremely nasty grimaces. Release! With Wang Chong stopping the behemoth, Chun Bin and his men excitedly worked at their task. With a wave of Chun Bin's wood steel sword, the second giant ballista bolt was fired, swiftly sinking into the behemoth's skull. Hurry, faster! Chun Bin urged his men on. After their experience loading and firing twice, his men were much faster at loading the giant ballista. Boom! Another 10-meter-long ballista bolt came hot on the heels of the second, nailing itself into the behemoth's head. Wang Chong and the giant ballista worked in close collaboration. While Wang Chong's cudgel attacked from the front, the giant ballista fired from the rear. Ballista bolt after ballista bolt sank into the behemoth's skull, each bolt sapping away at its life. Boom! The final shot was not unleashed by Chun Bin's men, but from the nearby open gate of Talas. At some point, the second giant ballista had been finished and been pushed out through the city gates. Leading the team was the slender and still young figure of Sukhoi. With two giant ballistae, the army exploded with cheers, its morale at its peak, even greater than it had been at the start of the battle. With the bolt fired from Sukhoi's giant ballista, the distant-scaled behemoth finally crashed to the ground. The earth quivered under the impact, as if it was about to crack apart under the pressure. After taking 20-some bolts from the giant ballistae, the infamous terrorizer of the Arabian Empire had finally died, the last embers of its life having been extinguished. Protector General! Protector General! Protector General! All the soldiers within the defense line and inside Talas were cheering so loudly that they could be heard 100 li away. In the distance, the generals of the three opposing empires all had extremely awful expressions, particularly the Arabs. The terrorizer had a thunderous reputation, having destroyed innumerable cities. Nothing had ever posed a real threat to this behemoth, much less been capable of killing it. But now it had entered its eternal slumber. If they hadn't seen it for themselves, not even if they were beaten to death would they have believed it. This was undoubtedly a massive blow to the Arab army. Buzz! Without the slightest hesitation, Wang Chong raised his right foot, stepping over the terrorizer's corpse and striding into the distance. Chun Bin, Sukhoi, I'll leave the two giant ballistae to you. Work together to kill the last behemoth. Wang Chong's voice echoed in the air, but the person himself had already gone. In the distance, Gao Xianji, Chang Qianli, and Wang Yan were embroiled in fierce combat with the black boar behemoth. Their attacks were coming in fast and thick, but the behemoth ignored them, focusing all its attacks on Talas. The lofty walls of Talas were shaking, swaying more and more with each impact. The situation was perilous. If the black boar's attacks continued unabated, the entire city of Talas would collapse in short order. Yama's fury! Just when the black boar behemoth was prepared to smash into the wall once more, the black god King Yama leaped into the air and slammed the enormous cudgel burning with violet flames into the behemoth's head. At almost the same time, the giant ballistae under the control of Chinbin and Sukai also began to fire, two huge ballista bolts shooting toward the black boar's head. Ow! The black boar behemoth that was the destroyer gave off a shrill howl. This time, its hardy bristles and pliable, tenacious hide were ineffective. The long ballista bolts pierced right through its skin and skull to penetrate deeply into its head. The destroyer had finally suffered a wound of unprecedented severity. Bang! Bang! As the destroyer howled, two more ballista bolts thundered into its head. Its once exuberant flame of life seemed to suddenly be assailed by a snowstorm, instantly dimming. Wonderful! Gao Xianji, Chang Qianli, and Wang Yan were elated by this sight and immediately began to work with Wang Chong and the two distant giant ballistae. 1 second, 2 seconds, the black boar behemoth's vitality was dropping at an astonishing rate. Roaring, the behemoth turned its scarlet eyes to the distant giant ballistae and began to charge. This behemoth had originally been focused on attacking the city, but the damage inflicted by these two giant ballistae had been far more severe than that of the three great generals. Each blow sent pain all the way into its bone marrow, such that the behemoth could not simply disregard the attacks of the giant ballistae. Stop it! Gao Xianji and the others had been completely focused on the behemoth, so the moment it turned, enormous chains of stellar energy swished out and pulled it back. A few seconds later, the supreme desolation god, the mighty miracle god, Gao Xianji, and Wang Chong's god King Yama began to attack the behemoth's ribs. The behemoth charged left and right, but found itself stymied at every turn. During this entire process, the behemoth's head was struck by 8 more ballista bolts. Release! Release! The giant ballistae were lined up together, Chun Bin and Sukai swinging down their swords as they commanded their men to shoot. These two were the best ballista officers in the Tang reinforcement army, and they had only needed a short while to understand how to use the giant ballistae. Besides that, the two had also refined the loading procedure, speeding up this most important part of the giant ballista's firing process. Release! Release! One bolt was fired after another, the two giant ballistae showing a completely different level of power from when they were used against the hippo behemoth. Under the continuous fire of the giant ballistae, the black boar behemoth's vitality was weakened to an unbelievable level. These fucking bastards! I'll tear your corpses into shreds. As the destroyer was surrounded by the 4 Tang experts and constantly wounded by the giant ballistae, Mazel trembled, his rage contorting his face into a savage grimace. Mazel turned and yelled to one of the fearful servants behind him, "Hurry and call the destroyer back!" Although he was extremely unwilling, he deeply cherished each of these behemoths. The terrorizer was already dead, so Mazel could not sit back and watch as the other behemoth died at the hands of the Tang. Fweet! A moment later, a sharp whistle suddenly rose from the Arab camp. The sound of this whistle made the black boar behemoth in front of Tala's pause and turn its head toward the Arab camp. Boom! Without any hesitation, the illustrious destroyer pushed aside its attackers and began to madly charge out of the encirclement. Beast! Don't you think it's a little too late to think about escaping? Chun Bin and Sukai sneered at this sight. If the Arabs had called back the black boar behemoth earlier, they might have still had a chance, but now the behemoth had at least 20 ballista bolts sticking out of its head, each of them hammered deep into its skull by Wang Chong's cudgel. In this situation, even something as tenacious as this behemoth was teetering on the edge of death. Boom! Boom! With another wave of Chun Bin's and Sukai's swords, 2 more ballista bolts struck the behemoth's head. The behemoth was extremely fast, and in the blink of an eye, it had covered 50 zhang. Boom! Boom! 2 more ballista bolts struck its head. 70 zhang. Boom! Boom! Another pair arrived. Rumble! 150 zhang. Yet another 2 ballista bolts struck true, and with one last howl, the black boar behemoth crashed into the ground, stirring up a cloud of dust. With the battle concluded, everything fell quiet. The first cheers exploded from the Tang soldiers atop the walls of Talas. The enormous pressure that had hung over all their heads had finally dispersed. Won! We won! The Tang soldiers and mercenaries waved their hands in the air, their faces red from excitement. Through the corpses of the three behemoths, the Great Tang had once more displayed its power to its enemies. More importantly, the army finally had a weapon capable of dealing with these monsters. The army of 100,000 had one more tool in its arsenal to help it survive this battle. It's over. The Arabian behemoths could not pose a threat. In the end, it seems like it's still up to us. The celestial wolf Great General Wuxia stood atop a hill with barely concealed disappointment in his eyes. He had held a great deal of hope in these enormous beasts, but the giant ballistae had ensured that there would be no suspense. Now that the Great Tang had this sort of weapon, the behemoths no longer posed a very large threat. It's still too early to cast judgment. A voice came from the side. Wuxia had already turned and was preparing to head back to his army. But this voice made him stop and turn in confusion to Dalawan Ruozan. Haha! Has General not realized? The Tang defense line has been completely opened up. Dalawan Ruozan spoke in a laid-back tone, but Wuxia trembled at these words, his head twisting to look at the first defense line. In this battle, everyone's attention had been drawn away by the enormous size of the behemoths, even Wuxia's. Little attention had been paid to the two steel defense lines the Great Tang had built up in front of Tala's. Buzz! As he scanned the first Tang defense line, Wuxia's pupils constricted as if he had been given a sudden jab. This! At the very start, the first defense line in front of Tala's had been straight, firm, and valiant, offering the Tang a powerful fortification and lifeline. But now, Wuxia was seeing a twisted and crooked line, with large gaps punched through that once majestic line of walls. From what he could see, the length of the defense line that had been twisted and battered was more than 1,000 zhang. Such a large gap in the Tang defense was extremely lethal. Simply put, the Arabs could put aside attacks on the rest of the defense line and focus all their power on that one gap. From a certain perspective, the first defense line existed only in name. The Great Tang had lost their most powerful defensive line against the Arabs. The Great Tang was now in a crisis. How could this be? Wuxia took in a deep breath, not daring to believe his eyes. He recalled that the first behemoth had not been able to inflict this much damage. Although the Great Tang had lost around 10,000 men, they had killed the behemoth before it had been able to inflict very much damage. As for the second behemoth, though it had been stronger, it had only been effective for an even shorter period of time. Before it could fully exhibit its destructive power, it had been vanquished by the Tang Boy's God Transformation and the giant ballista. The Black Boar behemoth had also been vigorous in its assault, even causing many cracks to appear on the city walls. But in the end, the walls of Talas stood tall. In this aspect, the Arab operation could be considered a complete failure. But Wuxia had never noticed just how so much damage had been inflicted. What is going on here? Wuxia couldn't help but say. Haha, in truth, it began from the very start. You were all focused on the behemoth's battle with Wang Chong, not even paying attention to what else was going on. The behemoth attacking the steel defense line was far stronger than imagined. None of you noticed that its true power wasn't in its body, but in its 4 thick feet, Dalawan Ruozan said with a faint smile. A superb strategist had to be extremely perceptive, noticing the small details along with the large, noticing that which ordinary people missed and completely grasping the battlefield. Every time that behemoth advanced, it would always unleash wave after wave of shocks and vibrations. This is its true power, and those steel walls already began to collapse starting from that moment. All of you might not have noticed, but Wang Chong did, which was why he was so anxious and desperate. Dalawan Ruozan's words stunned even Huashu Huaitsong and Dusong Mangpoj, let alone Wuxia. There was no question that, just like Wuxia, they had not even noticed the other details of this battle. Dalawan Ruozan took in the reactions of his peers with a smile. In a war like this, he would always be able to notice more than people like Wuxia and Huashu Huaitsong. Although the behemoths are dead and the Great Tang now has heavy weapons capable of dealing with them, this battle is far from over. Abu Muslim is known as the most ambitious and most powerful governor of the East in the history of the Arabian Empire, as well as the one who has conquered the most countries. He can't not have a plan, nor would he ever allow the battle to end like this. Daluan Ruozen's eyes glowed with a perceptive light, as if he could calculate everything happening on the battlefield. This was the demeanor of a strategist. Wuxia, who had been preparing to leave, couldn't help but turn back around and walk back to the top of the hill. After a little more than a day, Wuxia had unwittingly developed a deep trust in this wise great minister of another country. The Tang giant ballistae might appear extremely formidable, but they're only useful against large-scale targets like the behemoths. For ordinary soldiers, they're just like catapults, all bark with very limited bite. Even though these behemoths have died, I am confident that Abu Muslim has considered the objective reached, with the Tang defense line completely open to them. Daluan Ruozen spoke fluidly, his tone assured and at ease. Moreover, if my judgment is correct, the Tang should only have 2 of these giant ballistae, 3 at most, and they were probably all set up on the spot. Otherwise, they would have used them against the first behemoth. Thus, the Tang are still in the middle of this crisis. The hill was quiet. Wuxia, Huashu Huaitsong, and Dusong Mangpoj all flabbergasted. If things really were as Daluan Ruozen had said, if the Tang really did only have 2 or 3 giant ballistae, then their situation was truly not as rosy as it seemed. If this really is the case, if we destroy the giant ballistae, won't they be finished? Dusong Mangpoj finally asked. Heh, who says that's not the case? Daluan Ruozen chuckled, a thoughtful smile on his lips. The first phase of the battle was over, but it was only now beginning to dance to the tempo it should have had. Daluan Ruozen was well aware that the next part of the battle would be more intense than any before it. In the distant Arab camp, the air was heavy and oppressive. The cheers from when the behemoths had first set out had long ago died away. When the black boar behemoth, the destroyer, fell to the ground, the more than 200,000 Arab soldiers had fallen eerily silent, not making a single sound. And in the rear, the air was even more suffocating. All the Arab generals were looking at that hunchbacked figure. Even though Mazil was a trusted aide of the Caliph and commander of the behemoth army, even he couldn't help but turn red in shame and grimace from all the pressure he was receiving. When he had just arrived on the battlefield, he had been bursting with pride and confidence, believing that his behemoth army alone could sweep away the infidels occupying Talas. But in the end, 3 of his mighty behemoths had died on the battlefield while everyone watched. Mazil felt like he had lost all his dignity. More importantly, Mazil and the behemoth army represented the Caliph as one of the strongest forces in the Abbasid Caliphate. This sort of result humiliated both the Caliphate and the Caliph. This was an accident, and I had no idea they had such a thing. The report you gave me said nothing of them having this sort of giant ballista. Such a thing has never happened before. Mazil finally could not help but defend himself. The surrounding generals remained silent, but their eyes clearly communicated their doubt. Arabia was a country of war, a country of conquest, and what it worshipped the most was strength. Without power, a strength that could inspire admiration, even a trusted aide of the Caliph was useless. If Mazil had succeeded in conquering their enemies and destroying their fortifications, they would have respected and revered him, even with his hunched back. But there was no doubt that he had blundered. Enough! Abu Muslim finally spoke. In the entire army, only he and Ziad did not criticize Mazil. Their gazes looked past the army to the enemy side. This battle was not Mazil's error, and despite the deaths of the behemoths, Mazil has helped us accomplish our goal and opened up the Tang defense line. Now it is our turn to attack. With these final words, a flash of frighteningly cold light flickered through Abu Muslim's eyes. His eyes had already locked onto that more than 1,000 zhang gap along the Tang defense line. Order the army to get ready. In addition, have the last army prepare to attack. Boom! A horn loudly blared, rising from the Arab army to resound across the entire western battlefield. What is this? In the distance, the Tang soldiers who were still in the middle of cleaning up the mess from the battle just now began to look up in shock. After 2 battles, the Tang army would immediately notice anything the Arabs did. But this was not the only thing that surprised them. They had always heard the Arabs use war drums to signal. They had never heard any horns coming from the Arab camp. At the same time, the four supreme commanders of the Tang force standing in front of Talas also had their attention piqued by the horn. What's going on? Are the Arabs going to attack again so quickly? Chang Qianli looked into the distance, disbelief in his eyes. I don't know. The Arabs rarely use horns. I have a bad feeling about this. Our next opponent might be even hard to deal with than the behemoth army. Gao Xianji was standing on the shoulder of the supreme desolation god, his solemn gaze fixed upon the somber ranks of the gathering Arab army. Abu Muslim is preparing to personally enter the fray. A calm and emotionless voice rang out in their ears. Everyone turned to that young and slender figure. Wang Chong, Gao Xianji, Chang Qianli, and Wang Yan all stared at Wang Chong in shock and disbelief. Abu Muslim has achieved his objective. Our strength has been weakened, and more importantly, he's managed to smash open our defense line. Wang Chong suddenly turned his head to the long gap in the first defense line. Without even needing Wang Chong's order, the craftsman had already gone to the first defense line to begin repairs. Thick coils of smoke were rising from around the gap, hundreds of thousands of furnaces spewing flame. Though countless craftsmen were working on it, the repairs were going very slowly. The hippo behemoth had not only destroyed the steel walls and scattered them all over, it had also completely altered the geography of the area. The steel walls could be repaired, but the same could not be said for the now uneven terrain, at least not in the short time available. The Tang commanders fell silent as they stared at the long gap, their expressions extremely grave. Disasters never came alone. During the two behemoth assaults, the Tang had lost more than 10,000 men, their defense line had been shattered, and Gao Xianji, Chang Qianli, Wang Yan, and Wang Chong had all consumed a significant amount of mental, physical, and stellar energy. They hadn't even managed to catch their breath yet, but Abu Muslim was already sending out his army of 200,000, even personally entering the fray. This was absolutely awful news. Wang Chong seemed to be the only person able to maintain his composure, but in his mind, he was just as unsettled as the rest. That horn. Is it the sky-quaking army? Wang Chong looked to the place the sound of the horn was coming from, his mind in turmoil. Gao Xianji and Chang Qianli couldn't hear anything special about it, but Wang Chong had recognized what that horn was the moment it began to blare. This was the horn of the sky-quaking army. The Arabs did not use horns. In the Arabian army, only one special army used this kind of horn. The sky-quaking army. Has it finally begun? Wang Chong inwardly muttered. In his last life, although he had never taken part in the Battle of Talas, he had memorized every detail by heart. The sky-quaking army had been a powerful force on that battlefield, intimidating everyone present. But this was not the first time Wang Chong had experienced its power. The sky-quaking army had also appeared in the War of the Southwest. These giants ranging from 6 to more than 10 meters tall had inflicted enormous damage on Wang Chong's forces. At that time, they had just been a simple army of giants. But Wang Chong was well aware that in this appearance, they would display a whole new level of strength. This would be the true sky-quaking army, a dreadful army of madness and destruction. It was when the sky-quaking army had appeared that the Anshi Protectorate army had been utterly routed. The legends claimed that the Arabs summoned and ordered the sky-quaking army by using a unique, massive golden horn. This horn had only blared once over the battlefield to close the curtain on the Tang army.